Hey, Dustin Vanoy here. There's a big announcement not too long back, in case you didn't see it, that Databricks Asset Bundles is now GA, meaning it's generally available. So the disclaimers about backwards compatibility and things like that have been removed, and it's really approved for production for all customers from the Databricks perspective. So I wanted to share with you in this video just a little bit more about some of the new patterns I've come across, including how to use some of the newer features in Databricks, and especially those related to bundles. I expect to add on some more short demo videos in the future as more things related to how to work with Databricks bundles or Databricks projects become available for you. Now, a quick description of what Databricks Asset Bundles is for. It's a way to define resources and workflows that can be saved into your version control. So your Git providers such as GitHub, Azure DevOps, and you're able to then deploy and run them via command line. This is useful either for development or to help you during the deploy phase of your CI/CD process. So if you think about, we've worked on some code, we've gone through pull request, everything's been approved. We want to deploy that from our original development environments into a test environment before it goes to production. That's where Databricks Asset Bundles can really step in and help you out. You can add that to your build pipeline and your release pipeline. It can deploy these assets, and it can actually run some of your validation workflows as part of that. So let's do a super quick review of what I covered in the past for those that haven't seen the original video I did with the preview version of Asset Bundles, and then we'll jump into some hands-on coding examples that I think will really help you get your head around some of the things you may want to do with this. All right. Okay, I'm going to show a little bit about my repository coming from Visual Studio Code and the overview of the bundle.yaml. If you really want to understand more about how you set this project up in the first place and what's in the bundle.yaml, please see my previous video where I talk about it just a bit more and go through some simpler examples. But the quick recap is I've got a repository here that I've got open. In this case, I've switched to a monorepo where I've got multiple projects within the same repository. And in this case, I want to deploy them separately, meaning there'll be a separate deploy pipeline for each one. Because I'm deploying those separately, rather than have a databricks.yaml file defining my bundle at this top level of my repository, I have one in each of my sub projects. So I've got a complex project here with its own YAML and a simple project with its own YAML. You don't need to do this all the time, but I often encounter people who are trying to do this type of style and curious where to put their bundle. This is kind of how you would do that. If you do want to deploy all of this together, despite having separate, sub projects within the same repo, you could have one single bundle at the root level. That's completely fine. You're just going to be searching for deployment, searching all of the artifacts for deployment together as one unit. So walking through briefly our simple projects databricks.yaml, I've got a unique name for it. I have additional YAML files that I want to include. That way I can separate out some of my YAML and not just have one giant file that's called databricks.yaml. So then all of my jobs and other resources are defined elsewhere, and my targets are what's defined here. In this case, I have a dev target, which is pretty typical. Within dev, I've set mode to development, which if you read the message above will explain how it's going to go ahead and add a prefix to it so that multiple users can deploy to the same workspace using mode development and automatically have a prefix on their resources. We'll see that in just a moment here. I also can say that this is the default environment, and then I can give it a workspace that is specific to this target. Essentially, I might just leave this one off because my default is this same host. However, if I'm going to deploy to multiple places, I would need to specify staging and production as different hosts. So here are examples of my staging, or sometimes we call it a test environment. It's ideally a separate Databricks workspace. If not, then I would just need to make sure I define a good root path that will not conflict with what I'm doing for development. And then I would also want to likely prefix or suffix some things on the job names, and I'll show you that when we look at resources. Finally, my prod is very similar to staging in this example. In your case, you may need to change it out to use a different workspace. Definitely, I've got my path parameterized here to make it more dynamic. And you may have additional overrides, and additional overrides can happen in this section, which we'll see in the complex project. So before we go look at what these resources look like deployed, we're going to kind of skim through what this is about to deploy for us, and then I'll show you what it looks like in the workspace itself. So if I look at my Databricks dabs job that was included because of my include statement in the bundle, it has a defined key here, which is what I would refer to it as if I want to do something like Databricks bundle run. I would use this as how I reference it within this bundle. When it gets deployed though, it'll show a name in the UI, and notice that I've added this bundle target variable that's going to automatically populate with the name of my target. So it's really easy to identify staging versus production if they do get deployed to the same workspace. For this particular job, I've set up a schedule. I've set up email notifications just as an example for you. If you take this same repository, do tweak these things so that it doesn't have my username in it. And then make sure that you define some tasks. In this case, we're going to run a notebook task. Here's an example of that with a dependency that installs from PyPI, or PyPI, I should say. In addition, we've got a refresh DLT pipeline command right here. Then we have another one that's going to run the main function within the Databricks dabs wheel. Okay. And then finally, all of those were referencing a job cluster. Here's where I've actually defined that job cluster so that this can be shared across everything except the DLT pipeline, which will create its own. That might seem like a lot to just visualize. Let's go take a look at what happens once I run my bundle deploy command. For good measure, I can go to the workspace that this is in. And you can see in my terminal at the bottom here, we do Databricks bundle deploy, and it will take whatever Databricks.yaml is in this directory that I just changed to, and it'll deploy those resources. It's going to do it to the default environment, which if you remember was my dev target. And here's where we find out if we have any errors in our bundle YAML. In addition, I could have done Databricks bundle validate ahead of time to validate the code and get a better feel of if it's going to work before I start actually deploying resources. Okay, now it's deployed. Let me jump over to my Databricks workspace and let's take a look at what got deployed here. Let's start by looking for this name though. See how I have Databricks dabs job? Because it's development, I'm expecting to find a name that includes the dev plus my username. In this case, my username is training. Then I'm looking for Databricks dab job. Okay. So this is the same thing that I defined before. It has a few things going on. First, let's actually see how it's defined so that this kind of puts it all together for us. If I clear a little bit of space, zoom in on these steps, hide the side pane, I can take a look at my notebook task and you'll notice some things about it. But for one, what we'll notice is that it is pointing to a path that lines up with what I defined in my bundle target. If I jump to that, I'll see that this lines up with what my bundle default is. The compute is called job cluster according to the specifications I defined in my bundle, and it uses PyTest as a dependency. So going back to how that looked in Visual Studio Code, my job here had a notebook task. It specified a relative path of what needs to be deployed. It specified PyTest, right? And then the job cluster here looks similar to what was deployed. As we keep going, you would see these other tasks that are out there, right? That's the idea. If I go and deploy to staging, I would just do that by doing Databricks bundle deploy with a target of staging, and it will deploy those same resources without that prefix into a different location in my environment. There it is. Jumping back to the environment, if I go and look for a similarly named job without all this prefix, I probably need to jump to another section. Here we go. It added the staging because that's my target. It again has not run this yet, though I think this has run in the past actually. Apparently a lot more times than my other development job. And I can see these same tasks. Okay, so something to notice that you may or may not have already caught is that this is going to give me a notification that this is deployed via Databricks Asset Bundles, which is telling me that I'm not allowed to make all of the changes I would normally make to a workflow in the UI. It's able to point to which repository and which branch this was deployed from, including this message, which is super helpful. It's going to let me see all of the settings. It just won't let me make changes to things like my task type, really any of the settings that we would need to change. So in order to make those changes, I can say, you know what? I know this is going to get overwritten the next time I do Databricks bundle deploy. That's the key thing to understand. If I really need to make some temporary changes and test them out, and I can't go back and deploy it from my local environment or wherever I deployed the bundle from, I could disconnect from source. It'll give me a nice warning that basically tells you, you should not do this. This doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not what's intended. Okay. Now, why don't we look at a few more things that would have been deployed? You may notice that there's quite a bit deployed to dev training, not as much deployed to with the _staging naming convention. We have Databricks Dabs job staging, notebook validation job staging. If I go back to my simple project, remember it only deploys what's in the bundle for the folder that I'm in when I do the deploy. The other things that are going on is I've defined a pipeline. This is a Delta Live Tables pipeline that does not include a schedule. This is the pipeline itself. I scheduled it from the previous job that we looked at. I also have one more job called Notebook Validation Job, which is exactly the syntax we saw with the staging suffix at the end. Okay, so let's go a little bit more specifically into some of the different task types and configurations you may want to use, as well as some tips that will help you get a little bit different type of reuse of code and variables across your bundles. Now, if you've seen this and you're really trying to grasp what this Databricks YAML does and how this was deployed, last reminder that I did a video in the past that covers the basics. That was more of a review and an introduction to this new Monorepo design. So go check out the other video if you're not following where these jobs came from. Let's start digging a little deeper and get through some examples that might help you along your way. Okay, so coming back to my VS Code, I am going to switch back to Complex Project and take a look at some examples that I think are quite interesting here. I have the privilege of getting to be asked some different questions about how to use asset bundles, and so some of these came from that work. I will say that there are examples of doing some testing mixed in here. I plan to cover that at some point in a different session or video. So I'm going to kind of skip the testing portion and focus on the resources of the bundle. All right, so in Complex Project, I've got a different Databricks.YAML. Some things will look very similar, of course, because I follow the same pattern. As we get to the good stuff, I now have added some variables. This is a way for me to override things in a bit easier way, to override settings that I probably want to override across multiple jobs within this project. So I've created a cluster Spark version variable and a cluster node type variable. And I probably am using these somewhere along the way. When it comes to targets, I don't think there's anything too exciting to show besides I did remove some of those other settings just because I'm using the defaults anyway for dev. And then for staging, I've included an override. In this case, it's a simple override because I'm just overriding my variables with new values when I go to staging. You may or may not want to override the Spark version across environments. That's a little bit risky, though you might deploy it with different versions for testing. I will more likely change node types when I go to production versus when I'm in development because I may need more memory per node when I go to production. In addition, when you're going to staging and production, you've probably noticed there's this need for a run as user so that it's not always running as the last person that deployed the bundle. Okay, let's start looking at what's in my resources directory, which kind of shows us which type of jobs we're going to create. I'm going to start with jobs group 1. The idea of this is that I might want to share cluster settings. Use the same job cluster settings across many jobs, and I don't want to have to keep copying and pasting that all over the place. We've already seen I can substitute some things with variables. We'll see kind of the rest of that picture right here. But what's going on is I didn't want to copy and paste job cluster definition code, so instead I've created a YAML anchor within the same YAML file as I'm going to use within the jobs I define here. So I've given it a name of my cluster. I've defined some job cluster settings that I originally had directly associated with my jobs individually. I've also kind of demonstrated some tags configuration here in case you need to use a YAML anchor for that as well. So I go through the normal sort of resources, jobs type of hierarchy that you'll do with Databricks Asset Bundles. Once I get into my task, I can define my job cluster key the way I normally would. And when I have a shared compute for this particular job, rather than have a bunch of things defined under job clusters, I'm just referencing that anchor with this syntax here. Looking at job 2, I've reused that same cluster. That's really the only really important piece to understand here. I've reused that same cluster via the anchor definition. And then as I get down to job 3, here I've defined the cluster a little bit differently, still using those variables. And I have set up some custom tags using my other anchor. Okay. So that's a way we can reuse some of our cluster settings within the same YAML file, which might lead to you grouping multiple jobs within the same files. Now let's take a look at a regular job that uses a library, which will explain what that extra library setting, how that would work in a traditional cluster that's not part of DLT. So here I'm looking at a job called shared lib job. Within the task, I've got libraries defined, and I've specified a wheel that is a workspace location. So that's where it's going to look for this wheel already built, already uploaded to the workspace, which is different from the common example you'll see where you actually let dabs build your wheel and deploy it with the bundle. Now, to explain why I'm doing it this way, this is to demonstrate that I might have a set of shared Python code that either doesn't exist in the same repository or it needs to be built and deployed separately from each of my different projects within my Monorepo. And I want both simple projects and complex projects to use the same code. In that case, you have to take a little bit more ownership of building the wheel, uploading it to your workspace or some other location that's accessible, and referencing it directly from your jobs. You could even have some substitute variables here about target, right? I could do shared code and then have dev, staging, or prod based on the target variable if I want to have a different version available to each environment. So I'll give a quick glimpse without getting into all of the nuances of building. The idea is that in my deployment flow, I would have a separate script that builds my wheel, make sure the directory shared code exists within my workspace. So I'm uploading as a workspace file. And then I use the Databricks CLI to import this to a workspace. So I copy the locally built wheel up to the workspace. You might also want to add a timestamp automatically to this script so that it will basically create a new version based on timestamp, and that makes it a little bit cleaner to override when you install it on the cluster that's already running. So with it set up this way, rather than the traditional way of having the source code in the same project and just specifying the path where you want the wheel to be created, we are able to deploy this. It will attach that wheel to the job cluster it uses. It will also then, because of the use for this other task, install PyTest from the PyPI repository, and then we're able to refresh our pipeline in a similar way that we've done in other steps. Here we have our job cluster defined. I'm no longer in that YAML that had the anchor, so I have to define the full thing here or add the anchor to this file as well. Notice though that as I change my node types between environments, that will actually make it to every different YAML file I have, not just the first one we looked at. Okay, so that gets deployed as a job that is called shared lib job. Now the other thing we could do is actually use serverless compute. So within my task here, I've got a very similar task. I have a Python wheel task. Instead of having a job cluster key, I have an environment key. And then the environment itself that I'm going to use is defined below. So we could either have what I would say is a default environment without any dependencies. In this case, I had my own wheel dependency. So I defined this serverless demo env, and that's going to have the dependency specified with it. So when we deployed, it deployed these two as well. Why don't we go take a look at what serverless looks like out here. If I go and take a look at the job itself, This version we can see is using serverless compute rather than a job cluster. In there, it's got an environment defined. If I looked into that environment, I would see it matches what I defined within my bundle. So when I go to run this one, it's going to quickly spin up that serverless compute. I'm expecting it to spin up in less than a minute here. Run quickly, use some sort of advanced auto scaling in order to process, and then turn off once it's done. We'll monitor how it runs right here. And then if I want to figure out costs, that's where system tables comes in, and I can go query my system tables after a little bit of time because those are delayed a little bit. I can query that and get a feel for how much was spent on this job and any other serverless compute cost. Okay, there we go. With the correct shared path defined, we've now got a successful run on serverless using a custom wheel. Okay, so let's do something interesting. Let's say I want to, right before I'm about to make changes and override it again, I want to disconnect it, tweak it manually through the UI, and then apply those changes to my bundle. How would I do that? So in this case, I'm going to go and edit my environment. I'm going to add an additional library, and I can confirm here and save that task now. In order to see what that does to my code, I can choose View YAML JSON on the workflow itself. So whether I created this from scratch or deployed it via bundle, I can go view the YAML. Notice that it starts at resources jobs. So it starts at the very top level and gives me everything related to how this is configured. I can copy that down. And then on my VS Code, I could actually make a brand new file. And within here, I can paste this whole thing and go back and find what I want to parameterize in order to keep this in line with my other settings. So in my case, I know that I want to have the name show bundle target. So I'm going to go back, change the name like so, add that to the end. The other thing I want to do, of course, is get rid of this prefix because that was added automatically. That's not something that should really be part of the name. Okay. Now this did include some additional settings that might be defaults that I didn't necessarily specify. So I could always go and remove some of this if I want to be sure. Probably not a bad idea. Most importantly though, what I wanted to show is if I go down and look at environments, I now have additional dependencies specified here for my environment. Realistically, the way I typically use this is I paste it in a temporary file. I grab the components that are really important that I didn't already have in my bundle, and I go from there. Okay, let's take that same idea of how we can get the YAML from a job and create a fresh one and get the YAML. So the idea here is if you're starting fresh, Databricks Bundle Init will give you some examples, and a lot of times those templates can get you a long way. But if you have very specific things you're wanting to do, you might be better off creating it via the workflow UI first, grabbing the YAML from there, and then you can go ahead and make it more dynamic. So we'll just call this sample 1 to keep it short. We'll call this sample task to keep that short. And I'm just going to do a basic notebook type. If you're not familiar with workflows, it's definitely worth keeping an eye on all the different task types you have available for you. And probably the more complex the type you get into, the more likely you may actually want to create it here and then grab the YAML. Okay, so I have one standalone notebook that's a good short test. I could either stick with serverless compute. In this case, what I want to do is actually say, let's define our job cluster. That might be more realistic to what you need help getting from the UI. We'll do a single user cluster with a recent LTS runtime with Photon enabled. I will pick, I think, a different node type here to make sure it will work for me. Let's confirm, keep it small, and there we go. Okay, so I confirm this. I have a job that likely would work. I could add dependencies. I can set parameters. I can do all of the good workflow related things right here. So again, to get that definition, I can go to view YAML or JSON, copy the YAML, then I'll go back to VS Code or wherever you're managing these files, and I can go ahead and add some task to, or some additional jobs to one of my existing YAML files, or I could go and create a brand new one in my resources that I'm including. So in this case, I go ahead and get rid of the resources and jobs because that's at the top of my file already. Make sure my job name or my job key is in line with my other job keys. Make my name a bit more dynamic if I want to. And from there, I can review these settings, make sure it's actually what I want to happen. Okay. Let's do a couple of honorable mentions about configurations that are in this repository today without going too deep. One of the things I want to show is that you can have your jobs actually point to Git repositories rather than the resources deployed as part of your bundle. The top question is, why would I do this? Normally, you probably wouldn't. Normally, you would probably just have this all together and deploy it as one bundle. But if you have external Git repos that you need to work with, and you cannot put those all as something that you deploy versioned with your bundle, then you have the option to define a path within a Git repo, define the source as Git. And then if you look a little closer, it has a whole Git source configuration in this case. So just be aware that you can do that. Again, you could build that with the workflow UI and then export this, which is how I created this in the first place. Final honorable mention is that if you have a lot of MLOps work, there's actually a really good template to use called MLOps Stack. So let me show you where you would find the information on that to get started, and then I'll leave that to you to do on your own. Here is the repository for MLOps Stacks. I'd recommend starting with the README because there's a pretty simple way using dabs to get going with this. As we scroll down, we'll find that there's a way to actually initialize this via Databricks bundle init. So right here, we can copy this command, go to our command line in a folder that we want to create a new MLOps Stacks project, and run this command. A lot more here to understand, what this helps you with, what this template includes, but just wanted to call that out for any more MLOps focused projects. I'd recommend this as your starting point rather than the repository that I've shown you. Okay, so we've looked through quite a few examples. This code is available on GitHub, so go take a look at it, try and pick and choose what's going to be helpful for you. And don't forget the tips I gave along the way about how to define your workflows through the UI if you choose to, and then grab that information and include it in the bundle itself. So stay tuned for more information on bundles, on some of the capabilities that will be provided to make development even easier, and other things related to Databricks and data engineering that I find interesting and think it's useful to share. Subscribe to this channel to definitely stay in the loop. See you next time.